Our next speaker is Chris, who's fantastic. Chris was essentially the central reserve. Anybody remember Linden Labs, Second Life? This guy was kind of the central reserve, the Federal Reserve of Second Life. One of the smartest guys that I've come across in town in terms of digital currencies. Come on in, sir. And we're just going to have kind of a fireside chat about what it's like to actually run a digital currency, because you're one of the OGs. So give Chris a big round of applause. And can we get like 2 little bottles of water? Thanks. Mr. Chris, thank you very much for joining us. Who are you, sir, and what is your background? Let's start there.
Sure. I have a computer science degree out of Harvard. I started a video game and graphics company. That brought me out here to the West Coast. Second Life, Linden Lab, makers of Second Life, acquired that for our graphics technology. And that really moved me into the fintech economic space. Second Life had a $500 million a year economy. While I was there, I acquired and ran their virtual goods web marketplace, brought that to about $20 million a year. Their Lindex exchange, which was $150 million a year. And like I said, user-to-user transactions of about $500 million to $1 billion a year, which at the time was gigantic. This was, you mentioned OG.
What year?
These are the days before cryptocurrency, 2007 to 2011. So, my first experience with Bitcoin and crypto was someone saying, someone's paying our users Bitcoin. Can you take a look at this and make sure there's nothing illegal here and nothing we need to worry about? And it was one of the first mining networks. Someone was convincing Second Life users to run software on their computers, which was mining software. And they were basically saying, you run this, and for every hour that you run it, we'll pay you a few Linden dollars. And they were taking the Bitcoins that were produced. And so it was a mining network that was literally paying pennies, fractions of a cent to people. And Second Life users, this was one way you get money in the system. Many folks, you talk about unbanked populations, challenges. That was one of the many ways in Second Life that people who didn't have either capital to invest or were somewhere where they couldn't get money into the system, hey, here's another way I can earn Linden dollars to spend in Second Life.
So explain to me, like in 5, what was Linden Labs and what was Second Life, if I'm a little bit too young?
Sure. Linden Lab was the company. Started really around 1999. It took them about 5 years to come out with Second Life. I believe from the stories I've heard, they started planning to do a physical rig for VR. They built a virtual world as a test area to demo that and discovered people loved playing around in this 3D virtual space. And so the company pivoted and they built what back then was called VR, and now you might just think of 3D gaming because it wasn't headset based, it was on a computer, but it was a full 3D representation. You had an avatar, and I think what really differentiated it was that they focused on not providing all the content. So Second Life decided we're going to seed some things and then we're going to provide tools, and so they created content creation tools that enabled any user on the platform to build and created a currency, the Linden dollar, and commerce system to where anyone could really easily make something and sell it to anyone else on the platform in a trusted way. The way that a PayPal brought trust to eBay and made it a much simpler platform to use. You didn't have to know who you were dealing with. You could trust the platform. And I would say it took off. It hit early adoption level. It hit 1 million monthly active users, but it took off because of that creation. It was probably a platform that had 20% of its users instead of 0.5% creating content. It had people spending tens, if not hundreds of dollars a month. So most marketplaces are primarily consumer to merchant. Second Life was truly an ecosystem where money cycled. I can tell you more about that, but that kept it going even after it lost. It's still around now. And a lot of that is because a lot of the people spending money are earning, funds as well through dealing.
How many people actually started making a living in Second Life? Because I remember hearing that people would buy real estate in Second Life and create islands and that sort of stuff. Can you talk a little bit more about what types of businesses people were running in that?
Sure. I would say thousands made a living from the pays some of my bills, to it pays me a $60,000 a year salary, to I've become a millionaire. You know, the millionaire area, you're talking tens of people. But real estate was the first big one, the first millionaire that we had. Second Life initially created these land masses, and early on they said, you know, we don't want to be the middleman selling to individual people, so we're just going to sell these to whoever wants to partition them up. And one person, her name was Anchi Chung. She was, I believe, a Chinese person who had actually made money in Second Life as a call girl, partnered with a German businessman, and they bought all the land that Second Life initially sold. And then they partitioned it up and they sold it through. They became a reseller of land. They sold that through to end users. When I was there and when I left, there were probably 6 or 8 companies doing 6 figures a month, $250,000 to $500,000 a month in sales, in money that they were cashing out of the system. So you're talking some substantial businesses. And a lot of people, why do you want land? It's just like the real world. What do you want to do? How do you want to spend your time? There were people who created jeans, and someone would say, didn't the avatar get free pants? And we'd say, yes, but why do you buy in real life that $200 pair of designer jeans instead of the $20 pair you can get somewhere else? And it has to do with your persona, how you want to portray yourselves to people. That concept is really important to people, whether it's in the real world or whether it's an avatar that you're going around. You think about choosing your username on any platform, and most people spend time, that is part of their identity. So it can be weird at first, but you can draw a lot of parallels. So clothing was very big. That was probably half of the economy. I bet $250, $300 million a year that was appearance related. It was the avatar, the skin, the clothing that someone would wear, the animations for how you would walk. People did pets, was a big thing. People wanted animals to ride around, cars to get around faster, and planes. You had Sims that created sailing experiences because you could have water areas. So you would have vehicles. You had people creating tools. So I mentioned an ecosystem. You want to create a business? I'll create the vending machine where you could sell a bunch of things easily. I will create the greeter that greets your customers when they come to their store. So you get a lot of people doing business tools. There aren't a lot of platforms that have, that. One of the most interesting ones I saw while I was there was called Osimals. It was breedable bunnies, and it was the combination of a pet, a gaming concept for rare traits. You were breeding animals and they had genetic traits, and a razor blade business model. You had to buy food for these animals. If you didn't buy food, they would die in a way that you felt awful, and you had to buy high-end food. You couldn't breed the rarest traits unless you bought high-end food. And there were people spending hundreds of dollars a month. We had bunny farms. There were people with bunnies stacked up because they were building side businesses to breed animals to resell. And there were, so that company was making probably $250,000 a month out of nowhere. I mean, this is one of the biggest successes. And for about 6 months it rose and then it fell. But a whole area of side businesses, of animations for how you can hold your bunnies, homes for them, of people breeding and reselling, cropped up that was probably 2-3 times as large as the business those people created. And so, that's just one interesting area, homes. I had a friend who made $2,000 a month, probably, designing and modeling houses for people to put on their land. It's different for everyone. Sorry.
No, it's fascinating. It was crypto cats before crypto cats. You guys were crypto bunnies, but it was VR bunnies. Everything new is old. So how many people did you guys actually have managing kind of the economy and managing? It was you.
So before I took over, there were some other people. So I mentioned I went through a couple of phases of other things. I took over the economy for my last year or two. Before me, there were individual people, or 2 other people I know of that ran it by themselves. When I took over, I kind of went to the biz dev team and I said, this is great, I'm happy to do it, but we're setting monetary policy. I'm choosing whether or not to print and sell $60,000 a month worth of currency. Everyone's livelihood is here. I shouldn't get to decide that on my own. we should have a board. And I had a room full of people, they're like, you're absolutely right, and we don't have the time, just do it. And yeah, at the end of the day, I had full control over the account to source new money, to print money, to decide what price it was sold at, no oversight. I had access to 100% of the transactions and people's accounts. So through our CS tools, I could literally look at 100% of the economy. I would dump. If you've ever worked with an Excel spreadsheet with like 800,000 lines, there is a limit. There's like 1 million lines, but I've been there. I've just dumped. I mean, but yeah, no. For while I was doing it, it was me managing that component. Now, if I wanted to make selling currency was me. If I wanted to make a change, if I said, hey, we don't charge a fee, and I want to add a 5% transaction fee in World, and I did try to push that. Those were things that had to go up to our executives and just constantly got shot down for fear of change. So modifying monetary policy in terms of fees that we would charge to customers had to go up the chain. But being the Federal Reserve Chair, printing currency, analyzing things, reaching out to customers, that was pretty much me.
It's kind of a godlike experience a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it was weird. Like, I didn't think of myself as the Federal Reserve Chair at the time, but it's funny. You describe your job to people, and they're like, "Oh, so you're the Ben Bernanke of Second Life?" And it's like, I guess so. And it teaches you a lot. Someone asked about gold earlier, being backed in gold. I don't think if I ran an economy, I could have truly understand how much currency is I'm going to say con game, and not in the bad sense, but a confidence thing. No money is really backed in gold. And if you're backed in gold, what's the value of gold? At the end of the day, people believe gold has value because of rarity. Diamonds, artificial rarity. Most currencies are no longer backed. Most, like the US dollar, it's not backed by gold. It's backed to some extent by GDP, which gives it some stability and trust. But ultimately, it is the confidence that people have that if you can buy milk for $3 today, you can buy it for $3 tomorrow. When people really assess values of currency, they look at goods that most people buy and how has the price shifted on those commodities. And we saw this in Second Life.
So would you actually evaluate, when you're setting monetary policy, would you look at like the jobs numbers and inflation? And like, what decisions or what tools would you use to essentially determine how much money to print or sell a week or a month?
So on the tax side and the things that never really move forward, I was really looking at incentives to create. So we had an issue with finding good content being challenging. And one of the things that I saw was, the biggest thing in our web marketplace where we did charge fees was building up a sales rank on an item. We had an interesting place in digital goods where there was no cost of reproduction for most goods. So early on, I thought in my head, you want someone to effectively get 100% of their money back. But later on, you can actually charge much higher taxes or fees than you could on real world goods because it's 100% profit. It was all cost up front. So for instance, I had tried to push forward an incremental fee structure where as an item accrued more gross profit, the fees went up from 0 up to 20%. And I estimated we could average around 12%. And the reason people wouldn't try to just create new items and get out of that was the popularity you generated from that sales rank, from having that much sales, drove sales to you. So it was part of the value. So I like to look at, are there ways you can bring in money? And this is to fund a system. We had folks who told me, I went out to meet with merchants making 6 figures. And I'd ask them, would you pay 20%, 30% if you had these better tools to manage your business? And I was shocked at how many folks said, I would absolutely pay you 10% in a heartbeat. I would consider 15 or 20 if you could do A, B, and C to make my life better. And these were huge merchants in our business. So on that side, I looked at how do we fund a way to improve things. On the printing currency side, what I inherited was something where we pretty much just said, hey, let's keep the value stable of the currency. And that's not a good way to print currency. And what we started to try to look at a little bit more was, and we were looking at in arrears at the time, but I liken it to how many people are in your economy. and what's the average cost someone needs. So in the real world, how much money do you feel comfortable with being in your wallet when you go out? You know, when I was growing up, $10 is probably fine. I walk around San Francisco right now, I'm probably not comfortable unless I have $60 in my wallet. Plenty of folks probably 100 or 200. And that has to do with what the general cost of goods are, you know, for where you live. You can get an average per person, and then if you know how many people are in your system, if new folks are coming in, if goods are getting more expensive, you can figure out how much money do you need in circulation so that people feel they can get what they need, but you're not depreciating the value of the currency. And so that was really more of where I moved to with a formula. And before we moved to that, we actually had a run on the bank because we overprinted currency.
So you actually had a run on the bank in your digital economy. So what happened?
So we had a very stable value of currency. It was about 200, around the range of 270 Linden dollars to the US dollar. And all of a sudden, in a period of a few days, we saw that move, you know, 5–10%, just out of nowhere. Went to 300, you know, Linden dollars to the dollar. It hadn't moved like this in forever. Like the whole time there, you'd move a Linden dollar a month. And very quickly we said, what's going on? That was one where suddenly there was a room of people with 3 VPs and everyone on the biz dev team. This is before I managed the currency, but I took over after this. And what we figured out was a charity had come in, which was raising money, I think, for Japanese tsunami victims, and had raised about, I don't know if it was 30,000, 60, like tens of thousands of dollars of currency over a few months. We hadn't spotted that there was this one account accruing tons of Linden dollars, and the person managing it was like, I get to sell more Linden dollars this month. My revenue line looks great. Sell, sell, sell. So all of a sudden this account, and this has to do, you know, what restrictions you put in place. I don't know how this account had the ability to sell so much at once, but they dumped pretty much all of their Linden dollars. We had a very transparent exchange. All of the merchants, the landowners who needed to pay bills, looked and said, my transactions aren't going to close. My limit sell of my Linden dollars aren't going to close, so I'm going to move the rate. And you just got this leapfrogging of people leapfrogging and then afraid the market was going to move more. And so you got a classic run on the bank where people started to freak out. And, you know, and it started though, I mean, you think of this, $500 million a year in user-to-user transactions. You're talking within a month, $12 million in average probably going through the exchange. And it took order of tens of thousands of dollars to destabilize a $12 million exchange. And a lot of people don't understand that with the right transparency and visibility, it's not a huge percentage it necessarily takes to create that run on the bank scenario.
And so you were actually seeing a fluctuation of the value of the currency by like 10 or 15% based on like tens of thousands of dollars in a multi-million-dollar economy.
Yeah, so we would display, I mentioned transparency, we would show every price that people had a limit sell or a limit buy order at. If anyone's traded in a stock market, you understand a market sell or buy is, I want this to happen now and I'll pay the best rate. You are setting the time a transaction occurs. When you place a limit order, you're saying, I'll wait as long as this takes, but I want this value or better. And so the people on the limit side create the depth, the demand and supply that is there for the market traders. But those people still generally have an expectation of how long that will take. Really, merchants that really know the system will say, I've got 2 weeks before I have to pay my bills. I can earn an extra 2% if I place a limit order. But they still need to know it's going to close within 2 weeks. And since we had that much transparency, they know how much buying happens on average in a day. So when they see that, you know, 60 million Linden dollars are for sale at a certain depth, they go, okay. When all of a sudden someone places at a price ahead of them, a worse price, a huge order, and they see that pop up, they do the math in their head and they go, it's not going to be 2 weeks, it's going to be 6 weeks before I get my money out. And so all of a sudden they go, I need to pay my bills, I better move to that, or I better go ahead of them. And that was the domino effect that we just saw. It was movements of 1 or 2 Linden dollars at a time, but very quickly from hundreds of sellers.
And so what?
Sorry about the complexity there.
No, no, no.
It's a,
What did you
yeah.
guys? What did you guys do to actually help resolve that?
Two things. We had had a bug on the Lindex where we had overpaid people about $300,000 over the previous 3 months. That probably helped a little bit, but wasn't a huge portion of the run on the bank. But since we did that, and I had just figured out who all those people were, I reached out to all of them and I said, you have a great opportunity. The value of the Linden dollar has gone down by 20%, and I don't want US dollars. I want you to pay us back in Linden dollars. You get to make 20% for free if you buy back now. This market's going to restabilize. We're not going to let it move further, so you can pay us effectively 80% of the bank error that was in your favor, or you can pay us 100%. Pretty much all of those people who had known we'd catch it eventually jumped back in and placed buy orders. So that created a bunch of demand. We actually reached out, and I was making phone calls to major merchants, to the landowners I mentioned who do a six-figure business, saying, if this economy collapses, your six-figure a month business goes to zero. This does you no good. You know, your rents are set. We're not going to let it go. And that was the big thing. I said, we don't want to have to be the force. We've maintained we don't buy Linden dollars, but if we have to, we'll step in. I don't want to do that. You can make money if you step in now. So it was convincing them that they could turn around the market or that we would. And we basically went out and got a lot of the major commercial players to place buy orders. And once that demand, since we were a transparent market, started to show up, you saw the market stop moving. People stopped massively selling. It took about 3 months to come back. So you think, 20% decrease in value over the course of a week or two, probably 3+ months to come back, that 20%. A lot of it rebounded within the next week or two, but the last, say, 5% was, 2+ months.
And so let's actually kind of move the discussion a little bit towards like the world of crypto. And so I'm wondering if, are there analogies, for instance, between the change in price of the Linden dollar to essentially the boom that's going on in Bitcoin now? Like, how much money or how much buying do you think is actually, new money is entering the market buying to actually move the price this quickly up? Do you have any sort of sense of that?
I don't, especially recently. It has skyrocketed in the last, week. I don't think it takes a lot. I mean, I think the big issue is less how much is it and more what are people using it for. So, the thing with Second Life, even though we had that happen, was I had these numbers. I mentioned 12 million on the exchange. About 2 million of that was currency traders, was speculation. And that wasn't all a bad thing. Some amount of currency trading provides liquidity for merchants. When you get beyond that, it starts to add extra fees for people who want to get in and out. I would say my issue with the value rise isn't how much buying is doing it, but is it people getting that to use it commercially, or is it people who are speculating? The reason that's an issue is not just the volatility it creates, but how stable is it at that price? So if it jumps up to a price because a bunch of new stores started accepting it, a bunch of new consumers started to use it, there's stability. Those people are not going to drop that overnight. But if it's speculation, someone is just trying to ride a high, and at some point they're going to sell. And when they do, you're going to get a bunch of other people who suddenly start to sell, and you get, the volatility you see, which I realize, Bitcoin specifically has still risen over time, but there were days, I don't know if it's happened recently, but you go back a few years, where it declined 50% in value as well. So, my issue is I don't know that any of that buying is people using it for commerce. I mentioned GDP creating stability, and I think there are some other folks who could probably speak more to that. It was years ago last time I looked at it, but you go back to 2013 or 14, the stats I saw were that less than 1% of Bitcoins held were actually spent on commerce, and most of it was hoarding, was speculation, was investment.
And so in the Linden Labs economy, in the Linden dollar economy, it was about 2% of the Linden dollars were held for speculation? Or what percentage was that?
Well, I would say about 15% of the volume on our currency exchange. I would say about say $1.5 to $2 million out of 12 million probably that every month was currency trading versus businesses and consumers buying in. As far as what folks held, that would be a much smaller percentage because you figure, I don't remember the exact amount, but it wouldn't shock me if there was $100 million held, I just don't recall. But the currency traders were immediately buying and selling. So there's 2 million in volume, but there probably wasn't much more than that that was held as well, because they're just going back and forth. So even if you double that and you say there's 4 million, you're talking 15-20% of the volume on the exchange, but you're talking 3-4%, maybe less, of the volume of the currency in circulation is held by currency traders as opposed to people taking part in standard commerce.
If you had a magic wand and you could wave it and create a beautiful crypto economy that would essentially work, and that, you know, kind of the hopes and dreams and passions of people for cryptocurrencies as a currency came true, what would you actually do? What would you actually like to see in the crypto economy that's emerging?
Sure. One is I realize things take off because people see this opportunity to get huge value, but I think that's bad for commerce, that volatility. So I would love to see something that, you know, some system that was more controlled in terms of how currency was produced or when to prevent spikes. So, you know, in a managed economy, like I manage Second Life, we maybe would look at that and say, what's causing this? Do we want to prevent some activity? Do we want to print more currency? We were there to serve people that were merchants in our system. And as much as it might sound great to make money, merchants want stability. They want to know that they can pay their bills tomorrow, so they're not looking to speculate on what they're earning, in my experience. So I'd look to remove that. The problem with that is getting adoption if you don't have that potential rise. So, you know, hey, if I get critical mass onto something that solved that issue, great. One of the other issues is power consumption. I was talking to you about this earlier, and speed of transactions. I saw a statement that by the end of the year, Bitcoin would take as much power, the node network would require as much power as the entire US does for lighting all housing in the US. I don't know if that's accurate, but it's on that scale. And you think about, you know, is that necessary? There are lots of transaction systems that exist that are very inexpensive. So there are benefits to blockchain that I think are great, and to cryptocurrency. Is there a way we can reduce the transaction time of a node network? And I think people are looking at, rather than a gigantic dispersed network with, you know, millions of nodes, hey, can we build restricted networks where there are 5 or 10 trusted parties that manage this consensus? And then, you know, can we do it where it's faster and it takes less power and it's less expensive per transaction? So those are the things I'm looking at is, you know, how do we actually make it affordable? People think of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin as free, but I don't think of it like that. I look at the cost of a graphics card, I look at the cost of electricity, and I go, someone's paying that fee. And at the end of the day, right now that might be the growth in the market is absorbing that, but why should the end user making money get that transaction for free? And then when the market stops growing and it levels off, if it costs 80 cents to do a transaction, is that useful? When, you know, I run a company right now that has a managed currency, and I run it on AWS, and it costs me thousandths of a cent to do a transaction in probably a second. And I realize some people, you know, wouldn't want that, and there are benefits that I'm absolutely assessing with blockchain. But, you know, can I get a blockchain solution down to it can consistently fully close a distributed transaction in under 2 seconds, and it can do it at thousandths of a cent, so that someone on a virtual world can sell a pair of virtual jeans for a penny if they want. I mean, that might sound crazy, but we had a lot of transactions in Second Life that were $1 Linden. That's a third of a cent. Now, you know, on average, you're looking at under $1. We had plenty that were more. On average, in my current platform, it's probably in that 80 cent to $2 range. That's the average, but we do still have plenty of transactions that are, you know, in the 1 to 20 Gloebit range, and, you know, under 5 cents. So that works for me right now because of that cost. There are people who want to do that and want to sell there since there is no cost to the goods that they're selling. And I don't know if crypto will get there. So those are the problems in my head. Those costs, I think transparency, asked you a question, but that is interesting because people have this concept that financial transactions should be private. And on the one hand, I've talked about in the past about that being a downside to crypto because I think it's still hard to completely anonymize things. On the other side, I love transparency. It would be really interesting if the adoption of crypto and blockchain moved folks to saying, maybe the world would be better if financial transactions were not private. Would it be better if you knew what the folks were making? Would it be better if you knew, it didn't take a leak of the what are they, the Paradise Papers, the
Panama Papers.
There, to know that a bunch of folks were hiding, money overseas. So maybe that's not actually a bug. Maybe that's a feature. And when I look at blockchain personally, for me, I look less at cryptocurrency early on, and I look at things that people do want public. So I love the concept of land deeds, permits, any system where you want, like it's just considered a feature that it should be public. I'm like, boom, blockchain is wonderful for that. So the concept of should your financial transactions be private or not, I think is kind of core to the discussion of blockchain moving forward, because if there are a group of folks who say, you know what, we think there's a benefit to this being public. People should know who the person is invested in this company. You think of corruption in politics. If it were blockchain for donating currency to campaigns and you could track who invested in that super PAC and you could track the money back, there were foreign investors or there weren't, that gets really interesting. Right now you don't get to do that because there's an expectation of privacy. So if people think you can move the expectation away from privacy in financial transactions, I think that's a big boon for crypto, to where something that I consider problematic becomes a feature.
Interesting. Any questions?
You made a really interesting point about...
Really loud. Really loud.
You made an interesting point about the power consumption of cryptocurrency being a really large factor in its adoption, et cetera, and viability. That's a really contentious point for a lot of people, especially like myself, who's benefited from its rise and would like to see it keep going. Like in 1789, when King Louis XVI, wanted more money for his bullshit court in Versailles, they told him, like, we're going to put a stop to that. And the way they did that was to repurpose some medical technology at the time to chop off heads very efficiently, because if you don't do it any other way, it's really difficult to do. And I would assert that even if it cost them a shitload of energy to do that, because what they were saving was time chopping off heads, they would still use the guillotine. And so, like, a lot of what the Bitcoin political hardcore, if you will, if they are really the prime drivers of why it's really going up, not incremental news cycles, et cetera. If the real reason is because people actually want to exterminate the elite in some way with using Bitcoin as the method, does the power consumption really matter?
So the question is the power consumption of Bitcoin a feature or a bug when there's actually a significant cost to actually doing things to producing this Bitcoin?
I mean, is the utility they're getting from it actually, I don't necessarily believe you need this widespread adoption for Bitcoin to work. I think it just needs to be a means to an end.
Yeah. I think it's worth it to weigh, to the benefits outweigh the costs. I do think a lot of people overlook the cost of how much power is used, especially with Bitcoin on the blockchain. Ethereum might be a bit different. There are other currencies coming up that are built in other ways to consider that. And Bitcoin was the first, and people probably weren't thinking about that. But you are talking effectively a limited resource, or a resource that has cost to how it is produced in terms of effects on the environment, in terms of how it drives up price in other markets. If suddenly electricity gets more expensive because so much is consumed for blockchain, what does it do for the poor person trying to light their house so that their kid can do their homework at night? Those are potential impacts. I don't know enough about the global power infrastructure to say, is that a problem? Will it balance out? I just think it's crazy for that amount of cost to be spent on transactions. Now the other question is is Bitcoin a speculative device, or is it about, commerce? I personally think Ethereum's a lot more interesting. So if Bitcoin's goal isn't to support commerce, it's more about speculation or investment. Um, you know, Maybe what you look at as the costs is different, or the downsides, the benefits you're looking for. For me, I focus on commerce. I want to support commerce. I want to make it simple and inexpensive. I think commerce can be way less expensive than what credit card companies charge right now. I think it can be way more accessible. I think, the drive-in value that you mentioned, I think it's awesome that a bunch of people who were not wealthy, it's new wealth. I think upheaval in class infrastructure is great. I hate the SEC rules in the US that only wealthy people can get into pre-IPO startups. I think that's a huge issue for disparity of wealth. For most people in this country who are middle class, your one opportunity is to go into, let's say, a 401k, where some guy gets to take a bunch of your money to manage your funds, and that's all you have access to, and a 5 or a 10% return a year. And you don't have access to a market where you could truly make a fortune. And Bitcoin created that market, I think, for a lot of people. So I think there's a bunch of value in that. There's definitely good in that skyrocketing value that I won't, dispute that there's good that comes out of that. I just think as far as a commerce tool, that level of volatility and rise in value doesn't make for a good tool for a merchant to accept payment for the goods that they're selling, that they then need to turn around and maybe pay suppliers for. And rise in value is great, but if you only make a 5% margin and the currency you're accepting falls 20% and you got to pay your bills, all of a sudden you've lost money.
What value do you see in a system that lacks a managing party or a central bank?
Are there values to currency that aren't managed?
Yeah, what
Pros and cons versus managed versus unmanaged currencies.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of the pros of, say, managing a digital currency. I'm just curious, from your perspective, what you've seen as the value of having an unmanaged currency, or a currency may not be the right word, but an unmanaged system.
Yeah, I mean the true transparency of knowing that no one's doing something corrupt. That it's fully hey, I'm a software guy. If you can really think things out in a way that it solves all the problems, and we might get there eventually. I mentioned doing calculations for Second Life based on number of users and fees, but there are a lot of other things that were just hard to plan for. That account that accrued a bunch of funds, thinking ahead to say, hey, I need to look at, factor in, are there any accounts in the system that are accruing lots of money that might create volatility? So assuming your goal is to have reasonable stability, and it's fine to have the value of a currency change, it just, in my head, for commerce needs to happen slow enough that it doesn't remove the trust in the system. So in my head, instead of managing it and just looking at the supply side of how more currency is produced or how currency is removed from the system to retain some of that stability. I'm not going to say you can't get there. I think you'll go through 30 iterations of, geez, we found another thing, and so now how do you have a process to modify the way that happens in a way that everyone already bought into the system says, yeah, that's okay, we can modify that code base. But I think if you can get there, you could have something very stable, very trustworthy. A lot of people don't trust the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, let's say. They think that that's a bad system. So I've had it happen with my company, Gloebit, that I've had people say, why should we trust you and trust what you're going to do? At the same time, when I wanted to have an exchange where the currency, right now we're pegged, we'll eventually have an exchange, but we're pegged to the value of the dollar. I actually had merchants that just no one was comfortable accepting that the value would float. And so finally when I said, you know what, until you guys have that trust, we'll just peg it to the value of the dollar, that was when we got our initial adoption. So a lot of folks, geez, we want something that moves around, we want a system that we trust, and at the end of the day they said, the US dollar is stable enough, and I'd rather it's just pegged to that. And it was weird to see that. And I think we can get to that trust level, but you know, I think what people say they want, and then at the end of the day, what they're actually willing to use are sometimes, you know, two different things. And you learn that when you develop software for any customers.
I was very struck by what you were talking about when you started to have the run on the bank in Second Life, because it was very similar to what Morgan did in 1908 to stop the panic. He called his friends, he said, start buying. And that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve, when they realized we don't necessarily want 2 or 3 private people figuring out when to turn on and off panics. Given the current lack of liquidity in both in Bitcoin and in a large number of the ICO markets, there aren't a lot of market makers. There's not, and the inability, especially in the Bitcoin network, to clear transactions at any kind of scale. What is your perception of risk in crypto, and after, if you perceive there is a high risk, do you then perceive that there will be pressure to create a regulator to ensure that all of the people who lost their shirt don't do that again?
So the question is, what are the risks to a cryptocurrency when there's very low volume of trading?
Very low liquidity.
Very low liquidity, and it takes a long time to actually clear a transaction.
Hi. I would even look less at liquidity, and for me, I'm also someone who I don't want to just make money because I took it from someone else. I'm an entrepreneur. I want to create value. I want to create jobs. So I love what Hack VC is doing. I love smart contracts. When I think that Bitcoin is a bunch of speculation and you're making money potentially by getting the value to rise and, you know, sell to someone else, I do think a number of cryptocurrencies are Ponzi schemes. Not all of them, but I think some of them are. So I would say more so in assessing risk, I would look at, is there value behind that token? What are people using it for and why? So you're investing in, you know, there's value. It might not be backed by gold, but it is backed by something that there is value that is being created. If I'm trying to make money on the rise in value in this, why am I getting that? Is there value being created in the world? If that's there doesn't need to be a ton of trading volume to be comfortable that it's not going to just collapse. I do think it adds, you know, it absolutely adds risk that it's not there. But I would say my first thing wouldn't be how quickly can I close a transaction if I want to get out. Are there traders willing to, you know, buy and sell in this market and constantly have liquidity? And I'd start by looking a little bit more at, am I only buying X new currency because a bunch of people are hyping it and I think it's going to rise in value and I'm going to sell it 2 weeks from now once it's doubled? If you know nothing about why anyone else is buying that, that to me is a Ponzi scheme. You're hoping you're one of the early folks out, and you're going to make money off the fact that someone else goes bankrupt. Now, do I want regulation? No, I'm a bit libertarian in this sense. I think a lot of regulation hurts the middle class and poor people and enables the entrenched, you know, wealthy elite. When you add cost to a system, the guy who wants to put $300 in doesn't get to put $300 in, but the guy who wants to put $100,000 in can hire a lawyer. It's worth his cost to assess that or to file the paperwork or, you know, or whatever it is. So I think people should be allowed to lose their own money. For me personally, I wish the US said, you know, invest how you want. We've got safety nets in place. Like I get securities laws that states don't want to have so many people go bankrupt that the state is then footing the bill for these people. And I think that's why securities laws came into place. But I have started 2 companies where I have let people who are unaccredited invest money, and it was very hard. And I looked at what we had to do. And ultimately, we had to report a bunch of things to the state where we would only get found out or fined if we did defraud them and hadn't done this reporting. And I think someone doing fraud just wouldn't have done this and still would have taken all of their money. I don't get how this securities law prevented any fraud. It just added to my cost. So I think if you're looking at any regulation that might come in, you know, my advice if I was at a panel would be, how do you not make it onerous for the average person to get in? And how do you create something that actually prevents what you want it to prevent? TSA type things. Thicker cockpit doors that lock actually prevent someone from turning a plane into a missile. There are a lot of other rules, like that's a good new regulation. There are a lot of other things that are a lot of time, person time, man hours that it costs, cost to airports, cost to people for flying, that it is questionable whether they really prevent something or are necessary. Weird parallel, but it's an area that one piece of regulation I think was great post 9/11, and almost every other security mechanism for me, I wish I had the ability as a consumer to say, I want to fly the airplane, that I want to take the risk that someone's going to bring something on board because I don't want those costs.
I'd rather fly the airplane than stand in line and get patted down. Right here. And we probably have room for another 2 questions after this.
I'll try to be quick.
So mine's super simple. Do you think Bitcoin's going to go off the rails?
Do you think Bitcoin is going to go off the rails?
Yeah. Where do you see the future of Bitcoin? I mean, it's really easy to create a long narrative about all the potentialities and use cases of cryptocurrency, but and which I think goes on pretty collectively everywhere in the world right now. But the simple question that I have is, do you think Bitcoin's going to go off the rails, and when and why?
I will readily say that you should probably take someone else's advice instead of mine, because when I started looking at Bitcoin, it was at 3 cents a Bitcoin, and I didn't buy any because I didn't even consider the fact that it might rise to some large level and I should make an investment. I was strictly looking at, like, do I think this will survive? Do I think it's good for commerce? And I would have said back then, I see this collapsing at some point, and I would have thought it would have happened before now. Now I'll caveat that, because that says, don't take my word and this is just going to continue to rise. Read The Big Short from Michael Lewis. There were a lot of folks who saw the housing market should have collapsed and was a bubble, and were very intelligent people. The ones you read about in The Big Short are the ones who had the ability, legal or monetarily, to continue to place that short bet for a decade or more. There were probably 100 times that many people who saw that and didn't have that and still lost their shirts because they had to get out. But at the end of the day, there were a lot of people with vested interests in keeping that market rising for years beyond where it should have. So I can't say for certain whether Bitcoin is in that space. There are a lot of people who have vested interest in it rising. I don't know enough about what backs that. Where's that money, coming from? So hard for me to say. You want to know? I would say start digging into who are the people that are hoarding, that are paying this amount of money, and what are they doing. For instance, if it's legit commerce, go buy into Bitcoin. If it's someone in Russia getting their money around sanctions and trying to move it discreetly, you need to ask yourself, is that going to get frozen? What happens when it does? If sanctions change and Bitcoin is no longer a mechanism for that, what happens if that demand, disappears? And I'm not saying that is what it's being used for. I just personally don't know. I don't research it enough. So I would say you want to go to someone who's really digging into what's driving, who are the buyers that are driving that value and why. And if that's legit commerce that you could see scaling and continuing, buy into Bitcoin. If it is someone who is just going to dump it and sell it in a month, I wouldn't buy right now, personally.
I have a question. How many people think that Bitcoin is going to double in price in the next 12 months? How many people think it'll drop by half? Huh? Interesting.
Both, yeah.
Not or.
Yes, and.
So you kind of alluded to this where you mentioned you're talking about value creation, right? More than just speculation. A lot of people are speculating in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Going back to Ethereum and smart contracts, you mentioned that you see that as actual value creation potentially for the long term. Could you talk a little more about that and why you think?
Why do you think Ethereum has longer staying power, for instance? Why are you more excited about Ethereum's long-term benefits than necessarily Bitcoin?
Part of it's that I think blockchain is, at least right now, better suited for things that are not currency related, and I see smart contracts as that. So, Bitcoin is more strictly, currency, and there's a question, is it being, I called Bitcoin early on a crypto commodity, not a cryptocurrency. I think of it as being more like speculating on the price of oil. and people driving in directions. And if you follow the oil market, that can happen at times where, your heating oil goes up in price because a bunch of people decided to buy and hoard or to sell. Anyway, on the smart contract side, I think there are really interesting things that can be done, and I think there's a lot of innovation going on around that. Consensus networks. I mentioned land, okay? In this country, let alone in others, you had in Detroit, you had a city government that thought that it did sell the same plot of land, the same deed to a developer and to a homeowner. You have people that got wrongly foreclosed on, that had paid their mortgage, but a bank filed some paperwork and it got approved, and now someone's coming to claim their house and they're in court. And so I think of, this is just one example, you encode land in a smart contract where you have a handful of keys, and a bank and a arbiter can foreclose. The city has a key, and the city and an arbiter can do eminent domain, and you have a homeowner that owns that, and the homeowner plus the lien key, which they get when they pay off their mortgage, can sell that property. And I'm not going to say there aren't some more things, but you go, geez, it's really easy to encode that. When you pay off your mortgage, it's really easy to know whether or not the key was turned over or you went through the process to revoke the lien holder key. There are things that you could verify. You can make sure that no one has sold your deed to a second place. The city can't do that. I think of the value the blockchain adds for that. This is just one type of smart contract. Now, in Bitcoin, I mentioned cost of transaction speed. Home ownership, there's thousands of dollars in closing costs. It takes 30 days at a minimum usually to close. So all of a sudden, if it takes a day to close that, not a big deal. If it costs you $300 to encode that in the block, not a big deal. It's a small cost. That might prevent tens of thousands of dollars of litigation later. So I think if the city deed agency could say, we don't need to have people on staff, we get these things out of the court 99% of the time. Maybe we're only going to court where someone says someone stole my key and I didn't authorize that. I see huge savings. So I look at systems like that and I see a ton of value. And that is why I see smart contracts as being incredibly innovative in how they change things. You talked about earlier the cost to selling someone $1 versus $100,000 of shares. And that's where I see this huge value and change in our system. So, it doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't have value, but for me personally, I think there'll just be a ton of things like that are smart contracts. I see a ton of people in Silicon Valley, discussing that. I went to a TechSoup, it was TechSoup, kind of brainstorming meeting where a bunch of nonprofits were looking at consensus networks. And I think we're looking at probably building that on Ethereum with smart contracts. To give you one example from that I thought was really innovative and solving global problems and not in a, hey, we can make lots of money way, was we have people who want to give grants to NGOs that are nonprofits. We have NGOs that are entitled to get information, but only if they are an NGO. But the current system is that you register with your government and they approve you. What happens if you're in a country that is hostile and you are an NGO that opposes the dictatorial rule? You cannot go and get that approval as an NGO. So they were talking about using blockchain as a consensus network, where they set up a handful of NGOs that everyone trusts to evaluate, and they create tokens which are effectively, you have been accepted as an NGO. And can we get grant writers to accept this blockchain consensus network for saying, great, I can write this person a grant and I can give them money? Can we as TechSoup take the data that we provide to NGOs and go, that person got access to this, and that is their permission to have access to this data that we provide. And so those are some of the things that I've been in discussions where I've had the privilege of sitting down with incredibly bright minds, and none of them are around, very little of that has been around, commerce. It doesn't mean I don't think commerce is huge. I think we need an international secondary currency used across the globe. I think you pay 10 to 20% more on goods due to the currency conversion fees that people pay to buy supplies and to sell a good dealing in different currencies. So I think there are huge savings there. At the moment, I don't see Bitcoin solving that yet. It might, someone else might, a managed currency might. But I see much clearer paths to smart contracts providing value very quickly in ways that you don't have to solve the gigantic energy problem of Bitcoin or the speed of transaction problem. When I close a transaction in my system, I just can't see a way I could do that on Bitcoin. I think there might be other networks, just from them being second generation, third generation. And the fact of the matter is, everyone seems to be building those on top of Ethereum as smart contracts.
Last question.
Hi, I was able to meet with Neo founder last week, and he was talking about how they're now they've created a network called Ontology. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. So what it is pretty much private blockchains for maybe finance institutions. So that way that they can control it a little bit more than just on the regular blockchain where it's governed by all of us. I wanted to know your take on that.
What's your take on private versus public blockchains?
I think it's really interesting, actually. So I want to take a look at this for my current company. So I manage the transactions. There's a lot of overhead to handling all of that, to costs, effectively building a commerce backbone. The way Visa and Amex, if you think about it, built a backbone that you think of your credit card, but there is a backbone network that handles the process of those transactions. When you build on blockchain, that's kind of handed to you, and you get a lot of people are creating tools to assess and manage that. So it's like open source software in general. You've got a bunch of people building on things. So I think it's really interesting, because if all of a sudden you go, we're going to run this on one node, we don't have to worry about propagation or a handful of servers. We don't have to worry about if this is public or private, because it's private within our network. But we have full audit trails of everything by doing it this way. And I don't have to pay a company $7 million to build a system internal that only I use, that I'm going to have to pay to manage and maintain and have problems with, and I effectively just get free upgrades in the system. That to me is really interesting. I've also been thinking about tiered private networks. So for me personally, I've got users in a virtual world that own a region of land and hold a transaction. They're on a larger world, a grid it's called, and then they submit to me. And I need to do all of this work to make the transactions they should have visibility to visible to them. And I think, what if there was a bit of a pyramid to where you had access to the piece of the chain for transactions that occurred in your system, and there were just default tools. So I think of a not maybe semi-public versus semi-private, but kind of connected private networks as well. Anyway, I think it's really interesting. I think it could cut costs down. I think it eliminates the issue of, are these things visible? Do people have privacy that they expect? You lose the public auditability of the system. And so then do you trust, if you want that company audited, do you trust whoever is a private company? Do you trust KPMG that went in and said, hey, we looked at it and we audited it? That's how a lot of companies do auditing right now. Once a year, they pay a big firm to come in and audit, and that firm says, we looked at their books, it's A-okay, we've kept all the data private, and then a bunch of shareholders go, great, we're good. I guess their job gets easier and that gets less expensive if every company is running things internally on a blockchain, and the data is there, versus KPMG walking in. I'm just using them as an example because that's who Second Life, I think, used, and they're in my head. And every company that they walk into being a 4-month process of digging through financials because, oh, you didn't track X, Y, or Z, now we need you to run all of these reports, and you need to send us this, and we need to look through, so I think costs could go down. Ultimately, short answer, yeah, I think very interesting. I don't know what the downsides might be. The other thing I have seen are, like I said, consensus networks. So in VR, I've seen some people talking about right now networks where there are going to be half a dozen or a dozen trusted parties, to where it's not just one company that controls it, but the blockchain's not going to be public and it's not going to be infinite nodes. It's these 12 companies control potential processing points. They sync up their chains, and no one of them, it would take all of them or 6 or 7 of them getting together to violate this. And does that give you more trust?
Thank you, sir, very, very much.